You are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. Today on the program, we'll be joined by Johan Calhoun of Chalkbeat to discuss the new school district of Philadelphia superintendent. State Representative Chris Rabb will join us to discuss the recently passed state budget. Brian Rademakers of the Philadelphia Water Department will be with us to discuss new programs for water customers. And our own Lance Haver will be giving us an update on the water rate hike. Lance, how are you tonight?
I'm all right. Struggling through the heat like everyone else.
It's going to be tough, and it's going to be even tougher this weekend, apparently. And Denise Clay Murray, how are you this evening?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Well, it's good to see both of you. So we're going to get right into it. Lance, why don't you start us off telling us a little bit about what's happening with the Water Board?
The Water Rate Board has decided to raise rates by $31.1 million. And I have filed an appeal to that decision. And I have filed an appeal because I do not believe the Rate Board was honest in what it was saying during the hearings. And let me just show everyone very clearly what the Rate Board hearing examiner told the public. If we could run that clip, please.
Let me take a minute and explain what this proceeding is about. It is not a general rate increase and will not result in any kind of a rate increase.
So if we can stop there. So that's what they're saying. They're saying that there's no rate increase that is available. And of course, that's not the case. The rates now are what they are. On September 1st, unless the court rules differently, the rates will go up by $31 million. And forgive me, I'm having a little trouble getting my slideshow up on the screen. If I can, thank you. There we go. So the appeal process is somewhat confusing. Here's how it works. The Water Rate Board is appointed by the mayor, and they appoint a hearing examiner. And in the past, I believe they appointed a public advocate to represent ratepayers. And they put up a notice saying how much the rate increase is going to be for. And then they say, here's the hearings. If you're concerned, come out. Then they make a decision. And after they make a decision, the rates went up. Or theoretically, of course, they could go down. That's never happened. But in theory, they could reduce rates. So they made a determination. They said, we're going to approve a $31.1 million rate increase. And I said the public didn't get appropriate notice, the public wasn't represented, and the hearing examiner misrepresented the facts. So I filed an appeal. That clip we just heard from the hearing examiner explains, without more than what I could ever say, how bad it is. Here she is saying no rate increase is going to happen. But we know that she recommended a $31.1 million rate increase, and we know the Rate Board decided to raise rates by $31 million. There is no question that this was a rate increase. The argument that the Rate Board is making and the hearing examiner is making is that last year they had a private agreement, a partial settlement, which said they could raise rates as much as $34 million, but they're only raising them by $31 million. So the $31 million rate increase doesn't count as a rate increase because it could have been more. I say that's misleading to the public, and had more people understood the size of the rate increase, more people would have participated. But it goes beyond that. Here's what the actual notice said. So if you're a member of the public and you're concerned about water rates for whatever reason, you read this notice on the Water Rate Board webpage. On January 21st, 2022, the Philadelphia Water Department filed advance notice of the initiation of a special rate proceeding. regarding the reconciliation and potential downward adjustment of water, sewer, and stormwater rates and charges previously approved to take effect September 1st, 2022. This proceeding is pursuant to the rate determination and joint petition for partial settlement in the 2021 general rate proceeding. Now, I think most of us reading this think that's good news, right? Potential downward adjustment of water rates. But that's not what it means. What it means is the $34 million that they could get could be adjusted downward to only $31 million. And that's in fact what happens. But people who are regular water consumers, who are concerned about things, they don't know what that means for legal terms. What they read is a public notice, and the public notice says there's a reconciliation and potential downward adjustment of water and sewer and stormwater rates. The home rule charter is clear. The notice has to be for the lay public. They have to have hearings, meaningful hearings, and if people don't know what's being discussed, they're not meaningful hearings. But it's worse because there was no potential downward. I participated in the hearings and I cross-examined Ms. Labuda. Ms. Labuda is the chief witness for the water department. And I asked, and does that in plain English translate to the rates cannot, through these proceedings, the rates cannot fall or be reduced below the level that they are at today? And Ms. Labuda says, subject to check, yes. So even though the notice said there's a potential downward adjustment, the water department's chief expert says, no, rates can't go down. So we have that. We also have the fact that the water department failed to get any stimulus dollars. And again, Ms. Labuda, the chief witness, says, we did not receive a reimbursement under the original act for expenses related to COVID and budget expenses. And that was written in my testimony. But outside of that, I'm not aware of any direct receipt of funding to the department. I can't answer that on a citywide basis, but we didn't receive direct funding to the best of my knowledge. So we have a water department that rather than go after the stimulus dollars, decides they're going to raise rates on consumers by $31 million. Now, you'd think we'd be represented by somebody who's going to make sure that we're protected. And the rate board hires somebody, and they call that person they hire the public advocate. And the person who they hired was from Community Legal Services. And I know they have a response to this, and Larry's going to read it later. But I said, well, who does the public advocate represent? Do they represent the public? And the answer is no, they don't. Do they have a client group? No, they don't. Do they meet with the public? No, they don't. So I challenged the rate increase, saying the public wasn't represented rightly. There was no public representation. And here's what the rate board said in their opinion. We reiterate that neither the public in general nor Mr. Haver in particular is the client of Community Legal Services, a vendor providing certain specific non-legal services under contract with the rate board. If the rate board is dissatisfied with the services rendered, it can take whatever appropriate action is available under that contract. So here we see that Community Legal Services, even though it calls itself the public advocate, was hired as a non-legal vendor for the rate board, the people who are making the decisions. They were never hired to represent the public. And it goes further, where the rate board says, moreover, the contract does not provide for CLS to provide legal representation. So CLS is hired by the rate board, which sets the rates, as a non-legal vendor, and is not hired to represent the public or anyone. And they're not hired to provide legal representation. So that becomes a challenge, because if you listen to what Mr. Ballinger said at the hearings, he says CLS has been appointed to serve as the public advocate representing the interests of residential and small business consumers of the water department as a group. But again, going back to what the rate board who hired him and what they said, was, moreover, the contract does not provide for CLS to provide legal representation. They are providing a non-legal vendor services for the rate board. So for those reasons, I've appealed the decision. I've said the hearing notice was inadequate. They didn't say potential $34 million rate increase. They didn't say that the public isn't represented. And the hearing examiner actually, in her own words, said it is not a general rate increase and will not result in any kind of a rate increase. $31 million, a 7% rate increase, is a significant rate increase unless you're the hearing examiner hired by and paid by the water rate board. And what the legal challenge is this legal? Should this be allowed? A notice that doesn't say how much the rates will increase, the public misled by the rate board's vendor into believing the public is represented, and a hearing examiner misleading the public, claiming no rate increase will occur when she recommends raising rates by $31 million. Hopefully, I will have a better sense of what the court's going to do in the next couple months. But right now, the appeal is filed, and we're waiting for the judge to set up what's called a briefing schedule so I can see what the answers are going to be. And by the way, anyone who has any question about who Community Legal Services and Mr. Ballinger are representing should know that today they filed with the court's request to become a party to the appeal in opposition to my request that the rates not go up. So CLS is saying, and we're going to hear from them directly, they're saying they don't agree with me that the rate increase should be stopped, that the hearing wasn't a proper hearing, that they didn't mislead people by saying they represented the public when they were hired to be a vendor for the rate board. What they're saying is the rate should go up by $31 million. That's what they believe is best. Let me pause there and give Larry a chance to read Mr. Ballinger's response.
So we sent CLS this presentation so they knew what we were going to be talking about. And we said, if you'd like to respond or refute or comment on anything, please do. So they sent us, this is attributable to Community Legal Services serving as a public advocate. There we go. So I'm going to read this verbatim. On June 16th, 2021, 13 months ago, the board approved 2 successive rate increases to go into effect on September 1st, 2021 and September 1st, 2022. PWD was required to come back to the board for a determination on whether the second increase of $34.110 million should be reduced, and if so, by how much. No party appealed the June 16th, 2021 rate determination. So that determination became final and cannot be challenged in court. On June 15th, 2022, the board determined that the $34.110 million rate increase should be reduced by $3 million. Our own Lance Haver here appealed the June 15th, 2022 rate determination. If the court holds that the June 15th, 2022 rate determination was unlawful, the result would be that the $3 million reduction would be overturned and customers would have to pay more. The board has found repeatedly that Haver's allegations against the public advocate and the hearing officer are unwarranted based on mischaracterizations of facts and false insinuations. And they provide some documentation, which we can post perhaps. So that was their response to that, Lance.
And of course, I understand that. I mean, they're paid by the rate board to defend the rate board. And Mr. Ballinger just reminds me of the quote from Upton Sinclair. It is very difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. If Mr. Ballinger had bothered to report accurately, he would have saw that I have drafted for the judge a decision that would freeze rates at the rate there are now. So it would stop the $31 million rate increase from going forward. And it's not a surprise to me when you point out that somebody's being deceitful and dishonest, that person doesn't like you and accuses you of doing something inappropriate. I think that our listeners heard the hearing examiner say no rate increase can come from this hearing, and they now know that it's a $31.1 million increase. They now know that the rate board hired Mr. Ballinger to be a non-legal vendor and provide and not represent anyone. And he claims that he represents the public. So we'll see what the courts say, but not a surprise to me that Community Legal Services, very sadly, by the way, Community Legal Services has a great history, wonderful history of being on the side of poor and working people. Just a very sad day that the lawyers for Community Legal Services have misled the public and are now fighting to raise water rates by $31 million.
Right. Well, Lance, thank you for that report. And I'm sure there's going to be more to come on this as we head into the fall. Now,
Thank you.
Go ahead, Lance. I'm sorry.
I was just saying thank you for the time, and I will, when the hearing comes up, I will let people know.
Okay. Go ahead, Denise.
Well, I was just going to say that there's a big difference between 31 point anything $million and no rate increase. That's two diametrically opposed things, one of which does not make sense. Right. And my understanding of Community Legal Services was that that's where you went if you were having an issue with your landlord and you were about to be evicted and they advocated for you. So I'm really kind of surprised that this is the attitude they're taking on this.
I absolutely agree with you. I think it's very sad. But again, they get a nice payday from the rate board, and they were not hired to represent anyone, which was very clear, and they didn't represent anyone. Normally, lawyers have clients. Normally, lawyers have to go back to their client and say, this is what I think is best. Will you accept it? The way it was set up, because Mr. Ballinger didn't represent anyone, he didn't have to answer to anyone. So he could make settlements in private, which he says is appropriate. He says all settlements have to be in private. And he could cut deals, and he could get as an inducement for the settlement another contract for Community Legal Services. And he has no public he has to go back to and say, hey, just want to let you know I agreed to a $34 million increase or a $31 million increase, but don't worry, CLS gets another contract.
Okay. And staying on the topic of water rates, last week, the city put out a press release explaining all different kinds of programs to help people who have fallen behind on water bills or are having a tough time right now getting caught up. So we spoke with the water department to talk about what these programs are and how people can apply for them. So here's our interview with the Philadelphia Water Department. Okay, we're here with Brian Rademacher of the Philadelphia Water Department. Brian, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So before we start talking about the programs in place that the city just rolled out and has been rolling out, could you give us a little snapshot of what the water department actually is and does?
Okay, so we are a public utility operated by the city of Philadelphia. We've got a little over 2,000 employees. We provide drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater services to the city of Philadelphia and some surrounding areas. So altogether, we have about 1.6 million customers. And we really are a full service utility in the fact that we take the water from the river to your house, we treat it, return it to the river. So we really touch everything that has to do with water in the city of Philadelphia. But I think something that's important for people to understand is that we do not operate for profit because we're a public utility. So our goal is always to provide the best water and the best services possible at the lowest possible price. And I think that really makes us stand out. And one of the things that made me want to work at the water department was just knowing the fact that everyone who works here also lives in the city. We drink the water, we use these rivers. So people are really invested in the work that they do. When they're treating that water, they know it's going to their house, their neighbors. It's the same water they bathe their kids in every day.
Yeah. And, water's one of the most important things, if not the most important thing. Yeah. So with that in mind, the city since over the course of the pandemic has been rolling out some programs, protection programs for water customers. Can you walk us through some of those and tell us how people can access them?
Yeah, absolutely. So Philadelphia is actually very ahead of its time in the way that it deals with public assistance and trying to help out people who can't afford their water bills. actually started back in 2017 when we worked with City Council to launch what's known as the Tiered Assistance Program. It's one of the first nations, or one of the first programs in the nation that provides help to people based on their household income and other circumstances. And that, we've been sort of tweaking that as we go along. And, it was really great to have that in place when the pandemic hit, because it gave us some extra tools to help people who are going through issues such as losing your job. We have a part of that program known as a special hardship discount. And that, by showing that you're going through something like job loss, serious illness, other factors like that, we can work with you to get a lower bill that stays the same month to month, and you don't have to worry about getting shut off. So it just makes it much easier to budget and stay on top of your payments. So throughout the pandemic, when it first started, we restored water to everyone that had been shut off prior to that, and we also put a stop on all shutoffs. So that's been in place for over 2 years now. We actually haven't shut anyone off since 2019, the end of 2019. And that was, something we did as a sort of a public health measure during the pandemic, just to try and make sure that people felt comfortable, safe in their homes. They didn't have to go out to get water. They would always have water to wash their hands, flush their toilets, that kind of thing. I think that goes to demonstrate just sort of the compassion that is at the heart of the Philadelphia Water Department. We really, more than almost any other city in the country, have gone out of our way to help people throughout this, this time.
And earlier this week, the mayor's office put out a press release that talked about all different kinds of programs that were coming up, different things that would be helpful for citizens. What are some of those new things that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so getting ready to resume shutoffs again on July 20th, we were looking at ways that we could really, tweak our programs and our policies to make it so that anyone who really cannot afford to pay their water bill won't lose their service. So we're really trying to make this into a program where only people who can actually afford to pay their water bill but aren't doing it are going to be facing shutoff. So we've done things like we've expanded the maximum amount to $1,000, that you can be delinquent up to $1,000 and you still won't get shut off. We've made it easier to set up payment agreements. We've set up a debt forgiveness program. There's just all sorts of ways that we can help you out. But the main thing is that we need you to get in touch with us, because if we don't know that you're struggling to pay your bill, we don't know how we can help you. So it may be that a senior citizen discount is the right thing for you. You may get an adjustment based on your income. You might have a special hardship that you can document with us. There's also medical exemptions. There's so many different ways that we can help people, but the main thing is getting in touch with us so that we can help you out. So call us or go to our website. You can apply online. You can apply at various places around the city that will help you with your application. But again, shutoffs will be resuming. So if you're in that category and you're worried about that, or even if you're not, really just get in touch, because you could be paying a bill that's much lower than it is right now, and it'll stay the same month to month. So even if you're just worried about paying your water bill, get in touch to see what we can do to help.
If someone has over $1,000 that they go to the water department, what would you recommend they do?
Yeah, first of all, definitely call us or go to the website and send in an application, because right away, just by requesting an application or sending one in, you'll automatically be protected from shut off for at least 14 days. And while we're processing your application, you won't be shut off then as well. So that'll give you a little bit of buffer, some time to work it out. And depending on your circumstances, we can either get you set up on a program where you can start making payments, or that would be part of like the tier assistance program, for example. And that would help you avoid shut off, because people that are enrolled in that program will not be shut off. But if you don't qualify for any of the programs that we have out there, we have payment agreements. We've actually extended and we've put a lower down payment number there. So they're easier to get into than they were even before the pandemic. So that's just, one of the options. But again, the first step is getting in touch with us. And, I would definitely recommend submitting an application if you are more than $1,000 behind.
Okay. And what if people need repairs, pipes, those kinds of things? Is that something that they can still work out with the water department?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different programs that help with that. One is the homeowners emergency loan program, which is a zero interest loan that you can pay as part of your water bill. And that applies to things like your service line, which connects from the water main to your water meter, or like your sewer lateral, which goes out to the sewer from your house. If that's damaged and you can't afford to fix it, we have that loan program where we'll find a contractor for you, get that pipe fixed. But once it gets inside the house and dealing with that kind of plumbing, the city has a basic systems repair program that provides some funding for that kind of work.
Okay. And overall, it sounds like there are a lot of different programs now that people should definitely be looking into if they feel like they fall into any of these categories, or if they're behind, or if they're experiencing really any kind of issue. Is there anything else that people should know about in terms of what kind of assistance the water department can offer them?
Yeah, I mean, there are different, like, for like example, if you have a church and you are, worried about paying the bill at your church property, there's a charitable organization discount that you can look into. Is in one example of something that, that might not apply to a resident, but if you're part of an organization such as a church or a synagogue, and you're worried about that bill, that's another thing that people can get help with.
Okay. And where can people find information and applications for these programs?
The easiest place to go to is water.phila.gov/CAP or CAP. That's our customer assistance programs. And you can learn about all the things that are out there right now, and you can request an application. One other thing I did want to mention is that the state, as part of COVID-19 relief, they put out a low income water assistance program grant, which can give you up to $5,000 to help pay off a water bill. And there's also other state grants that are available. But the LIWAP program from the state, that's a temporary program. And once the money runs out, that program will probably end. So look into that right now because they could run out of money this month. And that's money that you don't have to pay back. They'll pay your full bill, up to $5,000. So that's something people should really look into as well. And
where can people find that?
There's information about that on our page, water.phila.gov. So you'll find it there, but you can also check the state's human services website. They have it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us and walking us through this. This is going to be a big help to a lot of people, especially now. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the time. Appreciate it.
Good evening, everybody, and you're listening to Hall Monitor here on WPPM 106.5. I'm Denise Clay Murray, and I'm joined by my co-host, Larry McGlynn, and we are joined by Johan Calhoun, who is the bureau chief for Philadelphia Chalkbeat, or Chalkbeat Philadelphia. I always mix that up, and I shouldn't. But thank you for joining us, Johan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, one of the most recent stories that you've been doing a lot of coverage about the new superintendent of the School District of Philadelphia. And one of the last stories that I read was about this consulting service that the superintendent hired for a whole lot of money before he even went on his listening tour. Can you talk a little bit about that and some of the reaction to it, and I guess what the story is with that?
Yeah, well, just to provide some context about the Bureau, it's essentially a two-person team. It's me and senior writer Del Mezzacapa. So at times we kind of trade off who is going to cover a board meeting, which happens either every third or fourth Thursday of every month. So let's see here. So Watlington was hired by the board earlier this year. And at the May meeting, I believe it was May 26th, the week of May 26th, there was an agenda item. And there's usually a large number of agenda items that they have to vote on. And this was agenda item 71. And this is an agenda item that was unanimously voted and approved by the board to contract this consultant firm, this education consultant firm, to provide transition services for Tony Watlington as he adjusts to his new role as superintendent. That's a whole nother story. So the agenda item had the figure listed as $450,000. And it had the consultant agency's name is Joseph and Associates, not to confuse it with Joseph and Associates law firm in Philadelphia. But the person who leads this firm was the former superintendent in Nashville, Tennessee. And right now he's based out of DC in Maryland. So I covered that meeting. And from what I remember, and the recording verifies this, is that there was very little discussion about the contract, who was running the firm, and what exactly the firm would be doing. Even though it kind of says that the firm would be helping Watlington in his transition, but it really didn't like outline exactly what the firm would be doing. So, you know, people are wondering and asking, why is this a big deal? I thought it was a big deal because it's not common to hire a consultant or recruit a transition team. It's not normal in Philadelphia for a new superintendent to come to town and for the first order to spend $500,000 on a consultant. And let me back that up. It is normal to hire a consultant or recruit a transition team, just to make that clear. It's not normal in Philadelphia for a new superintendent to come to town and the first order of business is to spend $500,000 on a consultant. That's not normal. It's also not normal that hire not be vetted. And it's obvious that this guy was not vetted the way it should have by the school board. And it's also not normal that you hire someone from out of state, be it Maryland or Tennessee, who is not familiar with the district and give them the responsibility, you know, to lead this plan that is uniquely Philadelphia. And when I say a plan that is uniquely Philadelphia, that's the school board's goals and guardrails. Mm-hmm. So those were the reasons when my boss asked me about proceeding with this and just putting it out there. And, you know, is this the news story? And those were the reasons that I gave her. And we just moved the story. Mind you, like I said, I only have like 2 people. I have like 2.5 people working in my bureau. It's me and Dale, and we have a freelancer, Nora. And there are tons of things that we could write about with the public education here in Philadelphia. But I just felt that with new leadership and with the new superintendent, because we had Dr. Haidt for like almost 10 years. We had Haidt for like a decade. So for a new person to come to town, I just felt that, you know, his moves, his orders, his directives, his hires should be under the microscope for the sake of the kids. And it's not to just throw him under the bus. All of this is for the sake of the kids.
So has he started his listening tour yet? And if so, you know, how do people make sure that they know when the listening tour starts and how they can be a part of it? Because I would think, and this is just, you know, what I observed from watching the superintendent hiring process. They brought in a guy whose last job was at a school district that was as big as the one I went to high school in. And that's not big. Mm. So how can people make sure that they're part of the listening tour so that when, you know, he comes and they can ask him questions, they know where to go?
Yeah, so you're referring to the listening and learning tour that's happening, you know, his first 100 days in office. I do not have the correct URL, but if your listening audience can go to the school district's website, there is a page that directs people to sign up to partake in that tour and to ask questions. So, you know, this is where we are with him. There are specific directives. He has like 3 phases that spanned out until, I believe, like next spring, the latter part of May, in which he's supposed to craft a detailed plan and how he plans on achieving the goals and guardrails. So this is like leading up to that. So it's like I said, I don't want to completely throw him under the bus, but I guess this is his strategy. But my thing, and I think other people are kind of criticizing, like, you're coming on board to lead one of the largest school districts in the country. Philadelphia has problems across the board. You should automatically have talking points. Graduation rates, test scores, student performance after they graduate. Are they working? Those should be talking points, immediate talking points. That is what Philadelphians want to hear. So if they're not hearing that, and if they're seeing that you're hiring someone for like $500,000, especially someone from Philadelphia, then it's going to kind of raise some red flags.
Okay. Now, he announced his transition team, which is co-chaired by Andrea Custis, who's the president and CEO of the Urban League of Philadelphia, and Dr. Guy Generals, who is the president of the Community College of Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about this transition team and what it's going to be expected to do? Because I'm looking at it now, and it's got a lot of heavy hitters on it.
Yeah, it's a lot of heavy hitters. I describe this as Wallington casting a big net, because you really can't fail. Well, you can fail, but you can find success with an 80-member team, especially with the 80-member team, with the kind of people that he has on his team. You mentioned Guy Generals and you mentioned Andrea Custis from the Urban League, and they're going to be like the co-chairs leading this effort. But you have 80 people, some heavy hitters, like you have Sharif El Mekki, who is well known in the community. Let's see here. You
also have the interim dean at Temple School of College of Education.
Yeah, and he also brought on the guy that used to lead the school district in New Orleans, and the young lady who just wrote the book about reform in education reform in Philadelphia. She's now in Baltimore, Kamika Royale. So, he should be commended for this move. I feel he should be commended in reaching out and getting support, because the list here is a mix of national and local heavy hitters. So I do feel like he should be commended in reaching out to the community, because he obviously did that. I just think that it shouldn't take this long to provide some kind of blueprint or immediate blueprint, because the situation right now with the schools is rather dire. The literacy rate, we have 30%, under 30% of third graders are reading at third grade level. It's just all throughout the goals and guardrails, things that he needs to be touching on right now, immediately. Especially, we are almost in August, and I believe students return. I think they return August 29th. So he needs to have something in place, like a short-term plan in place before those kids get back. Did I answer?
Now to our listeners who might not know what goals and guardrails are, can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, the goals and guardrails was crafted by the school board last year, as well as Dr. Height, and this is how they measure the kind of work that they're doing, the success that they're doing. So there are certain benchmarks within goals and guardrails. They take a look at literacy, they take a look at math scores, language arts, race and equity is also a big thing right now. So at the end of the school year, they take a look at these benchmarks that's supposed to be made. And if you're not performing as a leader, be it the superintendent or the school board body themselves, they hold themselves accountable. Now, I'm not sure how they plan on holding themselves accountable, but in regards to the superintendent, it's kind of easy. If he or she fails at this, then they push that person out.
Okay. Well, I'd like to turn it over to Larry McGlynn. Larry, do you have any questions?
I do. Thank you, Denise. And Mr. Calhoun, thank you so much for being with us.
Sure.
The first thing I'd like to ask you about, this is, I guess, a two-parter. First of all, how much impact and how much change can a new superintendent actually make based on the conditions that already exist? And what does that organizational structure look like? So you have the superintendent, who reports to them, and how does that sort of disperse all the way down to the teachers who work in the schools?
Well, it depends on the person's vision. It's important for someone to come in and to have a vision. Dr. Haidt, he had, his footprint is deeply embedded in the school district now because he was here for like a decade. So it's upon the person coming in, whether you want to follow him and basically follow his plan, and that's keeping his staff, or do you want to come in with your own staff and with your own plan? And that kind of goes back to the criticism people are criticizing Dr. Watlington, is that one, he's coming from a much smaller school district of 14,000 students, and B, he was only there for like within a year. I don't even think he was there for a year, but the school district before that, it was like 70,000 students. But give or take, if you step into a school district as large as Philadelphia, in a city like Philadelphia with so many problems, you need to have some kind of vision. So that's number one. And you might say, okay, this is one person, and you have a school board, and then you have 124,000 district students. And if you include the charter schools, it's about 200,000 students. So what can one person do? That one person can do a lot. It comes down to the relations with the school board. It comes down to achieving, now you have the goals and guardrails. How hard are you going to stick with that? How hard do you want to achieve those goals and guardrails? So yes, the one person can come in and make a lot of success, and one person can come in and make failure.
Now, we had 10 years of Dr. Haidt, and I think it's safe to say we understand what his agenda was, what his goals were. It may be too early to make an assessment on this yet, but with Dr. Watlington, do you see key differences, or do you think it's going to be a similar path to what Dr. Haidt started?
I don't think it's going to be, let me back up. I think it's still early, and I think people are still trying to fill him out, like his direction. He has said before that he's going to keep many of the higher ups in place. I do think that it's smart for him to keep people like Gary Monson in place, who's the chief financial officer. I believe the communications office, he's keeping that office in place. So it's really hard to assess the differences between Watlington and Haidt, what we're going to get from him. Really, it is, because he really hasn't provided much, except for the Listing Learning Tour. And, we got this guy, Sean Joseph, who was leading this education consultant agency. And then you have the 80-person team. So that's all that we really have to go off of right now.
Yesterday, we conducted an interview with State Representative Chris Rabb, and that's going to air also on our program with this interview. And he talked about education funding from the state coming to Philadelphia. We're seeing somewhat of an increase. Do you have any indication about how that money will be utilized, how it could be helping? Any thoughts on that right now, or is it a little too early for that?
Well, the good thing, Wolf approved a $1.8 billion budget to provide the district with $410 million in new funding, plus an additional $145 million in charter savings. So, with that money and with the ESSER money coming from the White House, things are fine temporarily. But after 2026, because I believe the district has until 2026 to spend the ESSER money, after that, once we get into 2027, things get kind of foggy. So it's kind of depending on how proactive people are, how proactive Watlington is. how proactive Yuri Munson is. Well, Munson basically laid out a warning at the last school board meeting, and he basically said, 2027, we're going to hit a deficit. So, which I think is smart, but I don't know. It's up in the air on how Watlington is going to proceed or how he wants to use that money. We are faced with a staffing shortage. We are faced with unsafe buildings before and after the pandemic, and we're dealing with a decline in enrollment. So that money can be used in so many places. We still also have issues with asbestos. So yeah, I think it's critical to have Jerry Jordan and the teachers union at the table in deciding how that money is going to be spent. But I shouldn't assume, but my thinking is that they've already decided that.
I would think so. So the last thing I'd like to ask you, so we have our new superintendent. School starts at the end of August, and he's going to be doing these listening and learning tours throughout the city. What are some things that people should be looking for in terms of major dates that are coming up, and then just things that will give us an idea as to what direction he'll be taking the school district?
Yeah. So this transition phase, he has 3 phases here. And we're going to keep track in regards to deadlines that they're supposed to make behind the scenes, building up to what's supposed to happen in the spring. May 30th, I believe that is the date. People should take note, because that is when he is charged with, or he has given himself the responsibility of coming out with a strategic plan and how he plans on taking on the goals and guardrails. So they have gone back, and I noticed with the agenda item, and I talked to my boss the other day, they have actually changed some dates listed within the 3-phase plan of when they're supposed to do certain things like site tours, assessing situations and following this at this time. They have changed dates within that time frame. So the ultimate date that people should wait on should be May 30th, when this guy is supposed to come out with this plan to take on goals and guardrails. Because everything else is kind of foggy right now. They are changing dates. So they're telling people to go to the website. They're constantly updating the website. So unless you are reading Chalkbeat, you would know these things.
Which everybody should do. I'd like to turn it back over to Denise Clay Murray.
Thank you. I have one last question for you, Johan, and it's based on something I saw you talking about on Facebook. You were at a school board meeting, and it was nearing the 11th o'clock hour. And I've seen other people tweeting from school board meetings that have, cut right into Jimmy Kimmel and stuff like that. Have they addressed what they're going to do about the fact that you have these school board meetings that sometimes go into the next day?
They have not. I do know that there are portions of the meeting are mandated by law. Mm-hmm. They have to discuss those things at that particular board meeting, but I do think that they can cut some portions down and, let's say, cut the meeting in half, have 2 meetings a month possibly, or have like a quarterly meeting that would address constituent needs, let's say student speakers or public registered speakers. That way you can give them more time to speak, because right now it's like 2 minutes. And I believe it used to be much longer than that. So there are ways in which they can restructure the meetings. They need to restructure the meetings, because right now it's not productive. It's not conducive, and it's not conducive for proper thinking when you are voting on action items. because a lot of times they're voting on like at least 80 action items. And if it's like 11 o'clock or almost midnight, there's no way you can think things through, if that makes sense.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today, Johan. We really appreciate it. This is Johan Calhoun, the Bureau Chief for Chalkbeat Philadelphia. And if you're not reading Chalkbeat Philadelphia, you really should, because you get really good information from that. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and we would like to thank Johan Calhoun for being with us here on the Philadelphia Hall Monitor. And we're running a little late, so what we're going to do is play a little bit of our interview with State Representative Chris Rabb, and we're going to play the rest next week on the show. So you have to come back and see the rest of it. So here's our interview with State Representative Chris Rabb.
Okay, Representative Rabb, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so the first thing I'd like to ask you about, the Commonwealth passed its budget a couple weeks ago. Can you walk us through how this budget can and will benefit Philadelphians?
Sure. With every budget, state budget, there are good things and bad things. And what's interesting as a legislator is, I think much in life, you can justify supporting or opposing things because it's so full of so many things. You can say, I'm supporting it because it has all these great things, despite all these awful things. You can also say, despite all these wonderful things, I'm opposing this measure or this budget or this bill because of the things that I strongly oppose. And so, yet again, we have a hodgepodge. And that's really indicative of the legislative process and the negotiating process between House Democrats and Republicans, the House and the Senate, and ultimately with the governor. So there's really 5 stakeholders, formal stakeholders, plus the general public across the Commonwealth. And so as a rank and file member, I am not a part of any of those negotiations. And in fact, this is the 6th budget where I find out essentially, the key components of that budget literally hours before voting for it. So it is often the case that I find out things that are in the budget from journalists and lobbyists before I figure it out myself, because these bills are so massive and so many things get shoved in under the cloak of darkness. So all of that is a preamble to say that the things that I like that were put in the budget clearly relate to increased funding for Philadelphia public schools. It's a historic investment in public schools, and yet nearly enough. It's a lot, given that I work in a chamber and in a legislature that doesn't really support public school at all. So the fact that we were able to get, I believe, I forget the exact amount, but well over $100 million coming to Philadelphia schools is saying something relative to my experiences in my first 3 terms. But it's something that we certainly can use immediately, and we desperately need more money. Of course, that's going to be up to voters in November and in each successive election with regard to the type of people they want to send to Harrisburg who will actually support full and fair funding of public education.
And you said something there that is concerning, though, regarding process. And we do like to talk about process. But when you get the budget just before you're supposed to vote on it, you can make the argument the budget's the most important vote you could take that year, because it's highlighting all the different priorities that the government's taking. Why is it that way? And is there any way to change that?
So the last question is the easiest to answer, and that is yes, we can change it. That requires the political will of the general population, voters and non-voters, people who have chosen not to vote or who cannot vote. either because they're not old enough or they're not eligible to vote or they have not found a reason to register in the first place, to say, I don't like how we're getting stuff done with our taxpayer dollars, because even children and non-voters pay taxes. Unless and until they understand that the way we've done it for decades and generations is not particularly democratic or good for the Commonwealth, then this will continue. And there are many things that have happened behind closed doors that once people discover is happening behind closed doors, they say, this shouldn't happen behind closed doors. But that's why independent media outlets like yours and others have so much work to do to raise the level of awareness and transparency around how things currently happen, and then leave it to the public to decide, is this good? Is this appropriate? Does this move us forward as a Commonwealth, as a city, as a society? And we can see that that's happened in the aftermath of the nonviolent protests stemming from the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. People were seeing the importance of police accountability when they discovered so many things were happening unbeknownst to them that were negatively impacting community safety, Black and brown people in particular. And that's when they said, okay, we need to have greater transparency and accountability in law enforcement. And that echoed in Harrisburg, and me and a handful of other Black legislators literally shut down, the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and demanded immediate legislative action on police accountability. And 36 days later, Governor Wolf signed 2 Democratic bills into law with unanimous support in the House and the Senate. That happened because people exercised their First Amendment rights, protested in 66 of 67 counties, and I don't know the one county where there weren't any documented protests, but that's saying a lot. In Pennsylvania, where only 14% of the population is Black, and there were all-white protests against racial violence and racial injustice, and we were able to get something done that had never been done before, create a police misconduct database, which was just in the news because a local law enforcement agency and township refused to follow the law and didn't do a background check, and it indirectly allowed for a child killer to get offered a job in a small town in Pennsylvania, and then he had to resign when the people found out what happened.
That's right.
All of this is to say that if once people realize what the process is and they see how hierarchical and inefficient and inequitable it is, and what that means in terms of how that may hurt the ability of legislators to do what they want them to do, something will change. But unless and until that knowledge is gained, it will continue on.
Where do you think the Commonwealth needs to make more investment in terms of anti-poverty funding and anti-violence funding?
Great questions. Well, on the anti-poverty front, like we have a serious housing crisis. We have a housing crisis among those folks who are homeowners who can barely afford the cost of home ownership, folks on fixed incomes who have homes in great disrepair. And then you have folks who are renters who can't afford the rent. And then you have folks who want to be first-time home buyers who can't afford it. This is an issue, and the irony is in Harrisburg, there's no housing committee. When I got elected in 2016, I took office in 2017, I wanted to be on the housing committee. And
Well, we're going to have to watch the rest of that next week. Thank you to Larry and Chris and Denise for getting those great interviews in. And we thank you for watching us on Comcast Channel 66 and FiOS 29.
Yes, and hopefully you all enjoyed the show. We don't know where Larry went. He just disappeared. But there he goes. But we'll be back next week with more of Hall Monitor here on WPPN. Until then, have a good night, everyone, and keep your eye on the news.